There are places in America where the horizon stretches so far that you can see tomorrow coming. Where the land is vast and unforgiving, where winter arrives early and stays late, where people measure distance in hours, not miles. Montana is one of those places. And in the winter of 1978, in a town called Lewistown, right in the heart of the state, something happened that would haunt the community for nearly 40 years. It was February, the coldest month of the year. Snow covered the ground in thick, uneven drifts. The wind came down from the mountains with a bite that cut through even the heaviest coats. Most people stayed indoors when they could, huddled near wood stoves, waiting for spring. But on the morning of February 18, 1978, 34-year-old Sharon Holst didn't have the luxury of staying home. She had a job to get to. She was a secretary at the county clerk's office, a reliable employee who showed up on time, did her work without complaint, and went home at the end of the day. She lived alone in a small house on the edge of town, a modest place she'd rented after her divorce 2 years earlier. She kept to herself mostly, though people in Lewistown knew her to say hello. She was polite, quiet, the kind of woman who didn't draw attention. That Friday morning, Sharon got ready for work just like she always did. She made coffee. She dressed in layers, long skirt, sweater, winter coat. She checked the clock, grabbed her purse, and stepped out into the cold. Her car was parked in the gravel driveway, dusted with fresh snow from the night before. She brushed it off, started the engine, and drove into town. She never made it to work. By mid-morning, when Sharon hadn't shown up and hadn't called, her supervisor at the clerk's office tried phoning her house. No answer. That wasn't like Sharon. She was dependable. If she was going to be late or miss a day, she always called ahead. By noon, concern turned to worry. By the end of the day, someone drove out to her house to check on her. The house was empty. Her car was gone. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication that anything was wrong. It was as if Sharon had simply vanished. The next day, February 19, a rancher driving along a remote county road about 15 miles outside of Lewistown noticed something unusual in the ditch. He slowed down, looked closer, and felt his stomach drop. It was Sharon's car, partially hidden by a snowbank, the driver's side door hanging open. And inside, slumped over the steering wheel, was Sharon Holst. She'd been shot twice. Once in the chest. Once in the head. She was 34 years old. And she was dead. The town of Lewistown, Montana, population just under 6,000, was stunned. People didn't get murdered here. This was a place where neighbors looked out for each other, where crime meant a stolen bicycle or a bar fight on Saturday night. Not this. Not execution-style murder on a lonely road in the middle of winter. The investigation began immediately. But from the start, it was plagued with problems. There were no witnesses. No clear motive. No suspects. And as the weeks turned into months, and the months turned into years, Sharon Holst's murder became a cold case. A file that sat on a shelf, gathering dust, while the person who killed her walked free. For 39 years. Until 2017, when a retired detective with nothing left to lose decided to take one more look at the case. And what he found wasn't just shocking, it was something no one in Lewistown could have ever imagined. Before we go any further, do good to subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell. Because what you're about to hear is a story that almost stayed buried forever. A story about a woman who deserved better. A community that lived with unanswered questions for 4 decades. And a truth so unexpected that when it finally came out, it changed everything. This channel exists to make sure stories like Sharon's aren't forgotten. To honor the victims who never got their day in court. To shine a light on the cold cases that law enforcement, for whatever reason, couldn't solve. Now, let's go back to Lewistown, Montana, in 1978, and understand who Sharon Holst was before that February morning took everything from her. Lewistown sits almost exactly in the geographic center of Montana. It's surrounded by mountain ranges on all sides, the Big Snowy Mountains to the south, the Judith Mountains to the north. The land is rugged, beautiful in a harsh kind of way. In 1978, it was a town built on ranching, farming, and small businesses. Everyone knew everyone. People helped each other through hard winters. And when something bad happened, the whole community felt it. Sharon Holst had lived in Lewistown for most of her life. She'd grown up there, gone to school there, married a local man when she was 23. The marriage lasted 10 years before it fell apart. No scandal, no drama, just two people who realized they weren't right for each other. The divorce was finalized in 1976, and Sharon moved into a small rental house on the west side of town. She was a private person. She didn't talk much about her personal life, didn't socialize a lot outside of work. But the people who knew her described her as kind, dependable, and hardworking. She showed up at the county clerk's office every weekday morning at 8 o'clock sharp. She processed paperwork, answered phones, helped people navigate the bureaucracy of permits and records. It wasn't glamorous work, but Sharon took pride in it. Outside of work, Sharon kept a small circle. She had a sister who lived in Billings, about 2 hours south, and they talked on the phone once a week. She had a few friends from high school who still lived in the area. She went to church most Sundays, though she sat in the back and left as soon as the service ended. She wasn't unfriendly, she just valued her privacy. On the morning of February 18, 1978, Sharon followed her usual routine. She got up early, made coffee, listened to the radio while she got ready for work. The forecast called for more snow, but that was nothing unusual. February in Montana was always cold and gray. She bundled up, walked out to her car, and drove toward town. Somewhere along that route, something went wrong. Terribly, irreversibly wrong. When Sharon's supervisor called her house that morning and got no answer, she assumed Sharon might have car trouble or had slipped on the ice. It happened. But as the morning stretched into afternoon and Sharon still hadn't shown up or called, unease began to settle in. By the end of the day, a coworker volunteered to drive out to Sharon's house and check on her. The house was locked. The lights were off. Sharon's car was gone. There was no sign of forced entry, no indication that anything was amiss. The coworker peered through the windows, saw nothing unusual, and drove back into town. Maybe Sharon had gone to visit her sister in Billings. Maybe there was a family emergency. Maybe she'd left a message at the office and it had gotten lost. But deep down, people were starting to worry. The next morning, when Sharon still hadn't turned up, the Fergus County Sheriff's Office was notified. A deputy drove out to her house, looked around, and came to the same conclusion as the coworker: nothing seemed out of place. But Sharon was missing, and that wasn't normal. And then, just after noon on February 19, the call came in. A rancher had found a car in a ditch off Highway 191, about 15 miles north of Lewistown. The car was a blue 1974 Ford sedan. The license plate matched Sharon Holst's vehicle. Deputies rushed to the scene. What they found was a nightmare. Sharon was still in the driver's seat, her body slumped forward, her hands resting in her lap. She'd been shot twice. The first bullet had entered her chest. The second had struck her in the head, just above her left ear. The car's engine was off. The keys were still in the ignition. There was no sign of a struggle inside the vehicle. No defensive wounds on Sharon's body. No indication that she'd tried to fight back or escape. It looked, the deputies would later say, like she'd been caught completely by surprise. Like she'd trusted whoever killed her. Right up until the moment they pulled the trigger. The investigation into Sharon Holst's murder began immediately. The Fergus County Sheriff's Office was a small department, not equipped to handle something like this. They called in the Montana State Police, who sent a team of investigators to Lewistown within hours. The crime scene was processed carefully. Photographs were taken. Evidence was collected. The car was towed to a secure facility for further examination. But from the very beginning, the case was frustrating. There were no witnesses. Highway 191 was a lonely stretch of road, especially in the middle of winter. The nearest house was more than a mile away. No one had seen Sharon's car on the road. No one had heard gunshots. The snow that had fallen overnight had covered any tire tracks or footprints that might have been left behind. The autopsy confirmed what everyone already knew: Sharon had been killed by 2 gunshot wounds. The bullets were recovered and sent to a lab for analysis. They were .38 caliber, a common type of ammunition. The angle of the wound suggested that the shooter had been standing or sitting next to Sharon, on the passenger side of the car, when the shots were fired. That detail was important. It meant Sharon had likely known her killer. She'd let them into her car. She'd driven with them, or at least stopped to talk to them, on that remote stretch of highway. And then, for reasons no one could understand, that person had killed her. But who? And why? The investigators started with the obvious suspects. Sharon's ex-husband was questioned. He had an alibi. He'd been at work in town the morning Sharon was killed, surrounded by co-workers who confirmed his whereabouts. He seemed genuinely shocked by Sharon's death, and there was no evidence to suggest he'd had anything to do with it. The police looked at Sharon's personal life. Was she seeing anyone? Had she been in a relationship? Her friends and co-workers said no. Sharon had been single since her divorce. If she was dating, she hadn't told anyone about it. Had Sharon had any enemies? Had she been involved in any disputes or conflicts? Again, the answer was no. Sharon was quiet, kept to herself. She didn't owe anyone money. She hadn't been involved in any legal battles. She didn't have any known adversaries. The investigators expanded their search. They interviewed people who lived along Highway 191, asking if anyone had seen Sharon's car that morning or noticed anything unusual. They put out a call for tips, asking anyone with information to come forward. A small reward was offered for information leading to an arrest. Tips came in, but none of them led anywhere. Someone thought they'd seen a dark-colored pickup truck near the area where Sharon's car was found. Someone else claimed to have heard gunshots around the time Sharon was killed, though the location they described was miles away from the crime scene. Every lead was followed up on. Every tip was investigated. But nothing connected. By the spring of 1978, the investigation had stalled. The police had exhausted their leads. They had no suspects. No motive. No clear direction forward. Sharon Holst's murder was officially a cold case. For her family, the lack of answers was unbearable. Sharon's sister, Margaret, drove up from Billings for the funeral. She stood in the church where Sharon had sat every Sunday, surrounded by people she barely knew, and tried to make sense of what had happened. Who would want to hurt Sharon? Why would anyone kill her? Sharon had never hurt anyone. She'd lived a quiet, simple life. She didn't deserve this. But there were no answers. Just questions. Questions that would go unanswered for the next 39 years. In the years that followed Sharon's death, life in Lewistown slowly returned to normal. People talked about the murder for a while, speculating about what might have happened, who might have been responsible. But as time went on and no arrests were made, the speculation faded. Sharon's case became one of those unsolved mysteries that small towns carry with them, a dark chapter that people remember but don't talk about much anymore. Margaret, Sharon's sister, never stopped asking questions. She called the sheriff's office every few months, asking if there were any updates. The answer was always the same: no new leads, no new information. Margaret wrote letters to the Montana State Police, to the county prosecutor, to anyone who might be able to help. She offered to increase the reward for information. She begged people to come forward if they knew anything. But the silence was deafening. The case file sat on a shelf at the Fergus County Sheriff's Office. Detectives came and went. Some reviewed the file, hoping to find something the original investigators had missed. But the evidence was sparse. The leads were cold. And without new information, there was nothing to pursue. By the 1990s, Sharon Holst's murder was largely forgotten. The original investigators had retired or moved on to other jobs. New crimes demanded attention. The world kept turning. And Sharon's case remained unsolved. Margaret passed away in 2003, never knowing who had killed her sister. She died still hoping that someday, somehow, the truth would come out. But as the years went by, it seemed less and less likely. And then, in 2015, something changed. His name was Robert Calloway, and he'd been a detective with the Montana State Police for 32 years before he retired in 2010. He'd worked on dozens of cases over his career, robberies, assaults, homicides. He'd seen the best and worst of what people could do to each other. And like a lot of cops, he had a few cases that stuck with him. Cases he thought about when he couldn't sleep. Cases he wished he could have solved. Sharon Holst's case was one of them. Calloway had been a young investigator in 1978, assigned to assist with the Sharon Holst murder. He'd spent weeks working on it, interviewing witnesses, chasing leads, trying to find something, anything, that would crack the case open. But it had all led nowhere. And when the case went cold, Calloway had moved on to other assignments, though he never forgot about Sharon. After he retired, Calloway found himself with a lot of time on his hands. He traveled a bit, spent time with his grandchildren, tried to enjoy the quieter pace of life. But he kept thinking about the unsolved cases from his career. The ones that got away. And Sharon Holst's name kept coming back to him. In 2015, Calloway reached out to the Fergus County Sheriff's Office and asked if he could take another look at the case. He wasn't officially working for them anymore, he was just a retired cop with too much time and a nagging sense that he'd missed something all those years ago. The sheriff, who was relatively new to the position, agreed. What could it hurt? Calloway spent weeks going through the old case file. He reviewed every interview, every piece of evidence, every tip that had come in. And the more he read, the more convinced he became that the answer had been there all along. It had just been buried under assumptions, under the limitations of 1978 investigative techniques, and under the passage of time. Calloway started re-interviewing people who had been questioned back in 1978. Most of them were older now, in their 60s and 70s. Some had moved away. Some had passed away. But Calloway tracked down as many as he could, asking them to walk him through what they remembered about Sharon, about that winter, about anything unusual that might have stood out. Most of the interviews yielded nothing new. People's memories had faded. Details had become fuzzy. But then, Calloway talked to a woman named Evelyn Porter. Evelyn had worked at the county clerk's office with Sharon back in 1978. She'd been interviewed by police at the time, and she'd told them the same thing she told everyone else: Sharon was a nice woman, kept to herself, didn't have any enemies. But when Calloway sat down with Evelyn in 2016, nearly 40 years after Sharon's death, Evelyn said something she hadn't said before. There was someone, Evelyn said quietly. Someone Sharon mentioned once. I didn't think much of it at the time, and I'm not even sure I remembered it when the police asked me back then. But there was this man. He used to come by the office sometimes. He'd talk to Sharon. She seemed uncomfortable around him. Calloway leaned forward. Do you remember his name? Evelyn frowned, thinking hard. I'm not sure. It was so long ago. But I remember he worked for the county, maintenance, I think. Or maybe groundskeeping. He wasn't someone I knew well, but I'd see him around. Calloway asked Evelyn to describe the man. What did he look like? How old was he? Evelyn closed her eyes, trying to pull up a memory from 4 decades ago. Tall, she said finally. Dark hair. Probably in his 40s. He had a way of standing too close, you know. Like he didn't understand personal space. Sharon never said anything directly, but I could tell she didn't like talking to him. Calloway thanked Evelyn and left her house with a small but significant piece of information. A man who worked for the county. A man who made Sharon uncomfortable. A man whose name no one could quite remember, but who had been around in 1978. Calloway went back to the records. He started pulling personnel files from Fergus County, looking for employees who had worked there in 1978. It took days, but eventually, he found a name that fit: Leonard Hayes. Leonard Hayes had been employed by Fergus County from 1975 to 1982 as a maintenance worker. His job was to take care of the county buildings, fix leaky faucets, replace light bulbs, shovel snow in the winter. He was 42 years old in 1978, married, with 2 teenage children. He lived on a small property just outside of Lewistown, a modest house on a few acres of land. Calloway pulled Hayes's file and saw that he'd been interviewed by police in 1978 as part of the general canvassing of county employees. His statement had been brief: he knew Sharon Holst by sight, had spoken to her a few times in passing, but didn't know her personally. He'd been at home with his wife on the morning Sharon was killed. He had no information to offer. At the time, the investigators had no reason to dig deeper. Hayes wasn't a suspect. He was just another county employee, one of dozens who had been interviewed and cleared. But now, with Evelyn's statement, Calloway started to wonder. He looked into Leonard Hayes's background. What he found was troubling, though not definitive. Hayes had no criminal record, but there were a few incidents over the years that raised red flags. In 1980, 2 years after Sharon's murder, Hayes had been accused by a coworker of making inappropriate comments to a female employee. The complaint had been filed, but nothing had come of it. Hayes had denied the accusations, and without corroboration, the county had let it drop. In 1985, Hayes had been involved in a minor altercation with a neighbor over a property line dispute. The neighbor had called the police, claiming Hayes had threatened him. Again, no charges were filed. Hayes said it was a misunderstanding. The neighbor eventually dropped the complaint. These weren't crimes. They were just patterns. Small incidents that, when looked at individually, didn't mean much. But when you added them up, they painted a picture of a man with a temper, a man who didn't always respect boundaries, a man who made people uncomfortable. Calloway decided it was time to talk to Leonard Hayes. By 2016, Leonard Hayes was 80 years old. He'd retired from county work decades earlier and was living in the same house outside of Lewistown that he'd occupied since the 1970s. His wife had passed away in 2008. His children had moved out of state. He lived alone, a quiet old man who kept to himself. Calloway drove out to Hayes's property on a cold morning in November 2016. The house looked much the same as it probably had 40 years earlier, small, weathered, surrounded by empty fields. Calloway knocked on the door, and after a long moment, Leonard Hayes answered. He was thin, stooped with age, his hair completely gray. He looked at Calloway with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Calloway introduced himself, explained that he was reviewing an old case, and asked if Hayes would be willing to answer a few questions. Hayes hesitated, then nodded and invited Calloway inside. The house was dimly lit, cluttered with the accumulated belongings of a long life. Calloway sat down in a worn armchair, and Hayes took a seat across from him. Calloway started with easy questions. How long had Hayes lived in Lewistown? What had he done for work? Did he remember working at the county clerk's office in the late 70s? Hayes answered carefully, his voice quiet. Yes, he remembered working for the county. Yes, he remembered Sharon Holst. Terrible thing, what happened to her? Calloway asked Hayes where he'd been the morning Sharon was killed. Hayes said he'd been at home. His wife could vouch for that, though of course, his wife was dead now, so there was no way to confirm. Calloway asked if Hayes had known Sharon well. Hayes shook his head. Not really. He'd see her at work sometimes. They'd exchange pleasantries. That was about it. Calloway let the conversation drift for a while, building rapport, making Hayes feel comfortable. And then, he asked a question that changed everything. Did you ever give Sharon a ride anywhere? Hayes blinked. A ride? Yeah. Maybe her car broke down, or she needed help with something. Did you ever drive her somewhere? Hayes's expression shifted, just slightly. A flicker of something, discomfort, maybe, or surprise. I don't think so. Why would I? Calloway shrugged. Just asking. People help each other out in small towns. I thought maybe you'd given her a ride at some point. Hayes shook his head. No. I didn't. Calloway made a note. Okay. But you did talk to her sometimes, right? At work? Sure. Like I said, we'd say hello. That's about it. Did she ever seem uncomfortable around you? Hayes's jaw tightened. What kind of question is that? Just a question, Leonard. I'm trying to understand what Sharon's life was like back then. Who she talked to. Who she trusted. I don't know what you're implying, Hayes said, his voice hardening. But I didn't have anything to do with what happened to her. Calloway held up his hands. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just trying to get a complete picture. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but Hayes had shut down. He answered questions in monosyllables, his body language closed off. Calloway thanked him for his time and left. But as he drove back into town, Calloway couldn't shake the feeling that Hayes was hiding something. The reaction to the question about giving Sharon a ride, that had been telling. Hayes had been caught off guard. And his denial had been just a little too quick, a little too defensive. Calloway decided to dig deeper. Over the next several months, Calloway worked the case quietly. He reviewed the original evidence again, looking for anything that might connect Leonard Hayes to Sharon's murder. He talked to people who had known Hayes in 1978, asking about his behavior, his reputation, his relationships. What emerged was a portrait of a man who was, on the surface, unremarkable. Hayes had been married, had held down a steady job, had raised a family. But there were cracks in that facade. Multiple people mentioned that Hayes had a temper, that he could be volatile when things didn't go his way. A former co-worker recalled that Hayes had been creepy around women, though she couldn't point to anything specific. And then, Calloway found something that changed the entire direction of the investigation. In the original case file, there was a list of items that had been found in Sharon's car after her body was discovered. Among them was a pack of cigarettes, Marlboro Reds, sitting on the passenger seat. Sharon didn't smoke. The police had noted this at the time, but they'd assumed the cigarettes had been left in the car by someone Sharon had given a ride to at some earlier point. It hadn't seemed significant. But Calloway remembered something. When he'd interviewed Leonard Hayes, he'd noticed an ashtray on the table beside Hayes's chair. It was full of cigarette butts. And they were Marlboro Reds. It wasn't proof of anything. Millions of people smoked Marlboro Reds. But it was a thread. And Calloway pulled on it. He went back through Hayes's personnel file and found a detail he'd overlooked before. In 1978, Hayes had driven a county vehicle as part of his job, a white pickup truck that he used to haul equipment and supplies. Calloway cross-referenced this with the tips that had come in during the original investigation. One of those tips had mentioned a white pickup truck seen near the area where Sharon's body was found. At the time, the police had followed up on that tip, but they'd been looking for privately owned vehicles. They hadn't thought to check county vehicles. The oversight wasn't malicious, it was just one of those things that falls through the cracks in a complex investigation. But now, nearly 40 years later, Calloway saw the connection. Leonard Hayes had access to a white pickup truck. He smoked Marlboro Reds. He worked at the county clerk's office, where he would have had regular contact with Sharon. And according to at least one witness, Sharon had seemed uncomfortable around him. It still wasn't enough for an arrest. But it was enough to bring Hayes in for another interview. In the spring of 2017, Calloway contacted the Fergus County Sheriff's Office and presented his findings. The current sheriff, who had been a teenager when Sharon was killed, reviewed the information and agreed that it warranted further investigation. They brought Leonard Hayes in for formal questioning. This time, Hayes wasn't in his own home. He was in an interview room at the sheriff's office, sitting across from Calloway and another detective. The atmosphere was different. More formal. More serious. Calloway started with the same questions he'd asked before, walking Hayes through his memories of 1978, of Sharon, of the morning she was killed. And once again, Hayes stuck to his story. He barely knew Sharon. He'd been home that morning. He had no information to offer. But then, Calloway brought up the cigarettes. Leonard, when we found Sharon's body, there was a pack of Marlboro Reds on the passenger seat of her car. Sharon didn't smoke. So we've been trying to figure out how those cigarettes got there. Do you have any ideas? Hayes shrugged. No idea. Do you smoke, Leonard? Used to. Quit a few years back. What brand did you smoke? Hayes hesitated. I don't remember. Calloway pulled out a photograph, a picture of Hayes's ashtray from the interview at his house. This was in your house when I visited you last year. Those are Marlboro Reds. Hayes looked at the photo, then looked away. So what? Lots of people smoke Marlboros. That's true, Calloway said. But not a lot of people who smoked Marlboros were around Sharon Holst the day she was killed. Hayes's face reddened. I told you, I wasn't around her. I was at home. Were you, though? Calloway leaned forward. Because we've been looking into your story, Leonard. And we can't find anyone who can confirm you were home that morning. Your wife's not here to back you up anymore. So all we have is your word. My word should be enough. It would be, if there wasn't evidence suggesting otherwise. The interview went on for hours. Calloway and the other detective pressed Hayes, pointing out inconsistencies, asking him to explain details that didn't add up. And slowly, Hayes's composure began to crack. He admitted that yes, he'd known Sharon better than he'd let on. They'd talked more than just casual hellos. He'd offered to help her with things around her house, fixing a leaky faucet, shoveling her driveway. Sharon had been polite but had always declined. She didn't want his help. Hayes said it had bothered him. He'd just been trying to be neighborly. Why had Sharon been so cold to him? Calloway asked if Hayes had ever asked Sharon out. Had he been interested in her romantically? Hayes became defensive. No. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like? Hayes didn't answer. And then, after a long silence, Calloway asked the question he'd been building toward. Leonard, did you give Sharon a ride the morning she was killed? Hayes stared at him. For a moment, he didn't say anything. And then, in a voice so quiet the detectives almost didn't hear him, he said, yes. The confession came slowly, in pieces, over the course of several more hours. Leonard Hayes admitted that he had seen Sharon on the morning of February 18, 1978. He'd been driving into town in his county pickup truck when he saw her car on the side of the road. She'd pulled over, maybe because of engine trouble, maybe just to check something. Hayes had stopped to see if she needed help. Sharon had been polite but distant, the way she always was with him. She said she was fine, didn't need help. But Hayes had insisted. He'd offered to take a look at her car, or to give her a ride into town if she needed one. Sharon had said no. She'd told Hayes she was fine and asked him to leave. And that, Hayes said, was when something inside him snapped. He couldn't explain it, he told the detectives. He'd just been trying to be nice, to help her out, and she'd rejected him. Again. Just like she always did. Like he was nothing. Like he didn't matter. Hayes said he'd gotten angry. He'd argued with Sharon, told her she was ungrateful, that she thought she was better than everyone else. Sharon had gotten back in her car, tried to drive away. But Hayes had followed her, driving his truck alongside her car, yelling at her through the window. Eventually, Sharon had pulled over again, maybe hoping that if she just listened to him, he'd leave her alone. Hayes had gotten out of his truck and approached her car. He'd leaned in through the driver's side window, still yelling. And Sharon, frightened now, had told him to go away or she'd call the police. That was the moment, Hayes said, when everything went wrong. He had a gun in his truck, a .38 revolver that he kept for protection. He'd gone back to the truck, grabbed the gun, and walked back to Sharon's car. He'd meant to scare her, he said. Just to make her see that he wasn't someone she could dismiss so easily. But when he pointed the gun at her, Sharon had screamed. She'd tried to start her car, tried to drive away. And Hayes, in a moment of rage and panic, had pulled the trigger. The first shot hit Sharon in the chest. She slumped forward, gasping. And then, to silence her, Hayes had fired again, this time hitting her in the head. Sharon had died instantly. Hayes said he'd stood there for a long moment, staring at what he'd done, unable to believe it. And then, survival instinct had kicked in. He'd driven Sharon's car off the highway and into the ditch, trying to make it look like an accident or a random attack. He'd left the cigarettes on the passenger seat, his cigarettes, left there by mistake in his panic. Then he'd driven back to town, gone home, and waited. When the police had come to interview him days later, he'd lied. He'd said he barely knew Sharon, that he hadn't seen her that day. And for 39 years, no one had questioned his story. Until now. Leonard Hayes was arrested and charged with the murder of Sharon Holst. The news hit Lewistown like an earthquake. Hayes had lived there for decades. People knew him. He was just an old man who kept to himself. And now, it turned out, he'd been a killer all along. The community was divided. Some people couldn't believe it. Leonard Hayes? The quiet maintenance man? It didn't seem possible. Others looked back at the rumors and whispers that had always surrounded Hayes, the complaints about inappropriate behavior, the temper, the sense that something wasn't quite right, and thought, maybe we should have seen this coming. The case moved forward, though slowly. Hayes's defense attorney argued that the confession had been coerced, that Hayes was an elderly man who'd been pressured into saying things he didn't mean. But the evidence was there. The cigarettes. The truck. The timeline. And Hayes's own words, recorded on video, admitting to the crime. In the end, Hayes pled guilty. He was 81 years old, and the prospect of a trial was daunting. In exchange for his plea, the prosecution agreed not to seek the death penalty. In the fall of 2017, Leonard Hayes was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would die behind bars. And Sharon Holst, 39 years after her death, finally had justice. The resolution of Sharon Holst's case sent shockwaves through Montana and beyond. It was a reminder that cold cases, no matter how old, can still be solved. That persistence matters. That one retired detective, working on his own time, with no resources and no authority, could accomplish what entire departments had failed to do. For the people of Lewistown, the arrest brought a complicated mix of emotions. There was relief, certainly. After 39 years, they finally knew who had killed Sharon Holst. But there was also anger. Leonard Hayes had walked among them for decades. He'd gone to the same stores, the same restaurants, the same church services. He'd lived a normal life while Sharon's family suffered. While her sister spent years begging for answers. While the community carried the weight of an unsolved murder. And there was guilt. People remembered the complaints about Hayes, the whispers that he was off, the incidents that had been brushed aside because they didn't seem serious enough to warrant action. Could Sharon's murder have been prevented if someone had spoken up sooner? If someone had taken those complaints more seriously? These are questions that don't have easy answers. For Sharon's family, or what remained of it, the news came far too late. Margaret, Sharon's sister, had passed away 14 years before Hayes's arrest. She'd spent the last 25 years of her life fighting for answers, writing letters, making phone calls, refusing to let anyone forget about Sharon. But she died in 2003 without ever knowing the truth. Sharon's niece, Margaret's daughter, was the one who received the call from the sheriff's office in 2017. Her name was Rachel, and she was in her 50s by then, living in Seattle. She barely remembered her Aunt Sharon. She'd been only 10 years old when Sharon was killed. But she remembered her mother's grief. She remembered the boxes of newspaper clippings, the folders full of correspondence with law enforcement, the phone calls that always ended in tears. When the detective on the other end of the line told Rachel that they'd arrested someone for Sharon's murder, she sat down hard, unable to speak. After a long moment, she asked who it was. When she heard the name Leonard Hayes, it meant nothing to her. But the detective explained, he'd been a county employee, he'd known Sharon, he'd been there all along. Rachel thanked the detective, hung up the phone, and wept. Not just for Sharon, but for her mother. For Margaret, who had fought so hard and for so long, who had died believing that Sharon's killer would never be found. Rachel wished, more than anything, that her mother could have lived to see this day. She traveled to Montana for Hayes's sentencing hearing. She sat in the courtroom gallery, surrounded by strangers and a few distant relatives she barely knew, and watched as Leonard Hayes was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs. He looked frail, diminished. Not like the monster she'd imagined all these years. When it came time for victim impact statements, Rachel stood at the podium. Her hands shook as she unfolded a piece of paper with notes she'd prepared. She spoke about her Aunt Sharon, about the woman she'd barely known but whose absence had shaped her entire family. She spoke about her mother, about the years Margaret had spent fighting for justice, about the toll it had taken on her health, her happiness, her life. "My mother died without answers," Rachel said, her voice steady despite the tears running down her face. "She died believing that the person who killed her sister would never be caught. That haunted her every single day for 25 years. And you," she looked directly at Leonard Hayes, "you let her suffer. You let all of us suffer. You knew what you'd done, and you said nothing. You went on living your life while my family fell apart. Hayes sat motionless, staring at the table in front of him. He didn't look at Rachel. He didn't react at all. Rachel continued. I'm glad you've been caught. I'm glad you're going to spend whatever time you have left in prison. But it doesn't change anything. Sharon is still gone. My mother is still gone. And 39 years is a long time to wait for the truth. When she finished, she folded her paper, walked back to her seat, and sat down. She felt hollow. Justice had been served, yes. But it felt incomplete. Like closing a book you'd been reading for decades, only to find that the last chapter was missing. The judge sentenced Leonard Hayes to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Given Hayes's age, it was effectively a death sentence. He would die in prison. There would be no parole hearings, no second chances, no possibility of freedom. At 81 years old, Hayes had maybe a handful of years left. And he would spend every one of them behind bars. As Hayes was led out of the courtroom, a few people in the gallery whispered to each other. Some felt the sentence was just. Others thought it was too little, too late. Hayes would die soon anyway. What difference did it make whether he died in prison or in his own bed? But Rachel disagreed. It mattered. It mattered that Hayes would spend his final days knowing that everyone knew what he'd done. In the months following Hayes's conviction, Robert Calloway gave several interviews to local and national media. Reporters wanted to know how he'd solved a case that had been cold for nearly 4 decades. What had he seen that others had missed? Calloway was modest in his responses. He hadn't done anything revolutionary, he said. He'd just gone back to the basics. He'd re-interviewed witnesses. He'd looked at old evidence with fresh eyes. He'd followed up on details that had seemed insignificant at the time but took on new meaning in hindsight. But more than anything, Calloway said, he'd refused to give up. He'd believed that the answer was out there, buried somewhere in the case file, waiting to be found. And he'd been right. When asked why he'd decided to revisit Sharon's case after all these years, Calloway's answer was simple. Because she deserved it, he said. Sharon Holst deserved to have someone fighting for her, even 39 years later. And her family deserved to know the truth. Calloway became something of a hero in Montana, lauded for his dedication and persistence. Other cold case units across the country reached out to him, asking for advice, wanting to know how they could apply his methods to their own unsolved cases. Calloway was happy to help, though he always emphasized that he'd gotten lucky. If Evelyn Porter hadn't remembered that detail about Hayes, if the cigarettes hadn't been left in Sharon's car, if Hayes hadn't cracked under questioning, any one of those things could have gone differently, and the case might still be unsolved today. But luck, Calloway believed, was just another word for being prepared when opportunity finally arrived. He'd done the work. He'd put in the hours. And when the pieces finally fell into place, he'd been ready. The resolution of Sharon Holst's murder had a profound impact on Lewistown. For nearly 40 years, the town had lived with the shadow of an unsolved murder. People had speculated, whispered, wondered who among them might be a killer. And now they knew. It had been Leonard Hayes all along. A man they'd seen at the hardware store, at the gas station, at the county fair. A man who'd fixed their sinks and shoveled their driveways. A man who'd seemed harmless. It forced the community to reckon with uncomfortable questions. How well do we really know our neighbors? How many secrets are hiding behind closed doors? And what responsibility do we have to speak up when something doesn't feel right? Several people came forward after Hayes's arrest, saying they'd always thought there was something off about him. They'd seen the way he looked at women. They'd heard the complaints. But they'd dismissed it as gossip, or they hadn't wanted to get involved, or they'd figured it wasn't their place to say anything. Now, they wondered if they should have spoken up. If they'd said something back in 1978, could Sharon's murder have been prevented? It was a question that didn't have a satisfying answer. Maybe yes. Maybe no. But the guilt lingered. The town held a memorial service for Sharon on the 40th anniversary of her death, in February 2018. It was held at the same church where her funeral had been, 4 decades earlier. Rachel attended, along with a handful of distant relatives and longtime Lewistown residents who remembered Sharon. A local pastor spoke about forgiveness, about healing, about the importance of remembering those who had been lost. A plaque was unveiled in Sharon's memory, placed on a small memorial wall at the church that honored members of the community who had died too soon. Rachel stood in front of the plaque after the service, running her fingers over Sharon's name. She thought about her mother, about how much Margaret would have wanted to be here for this. And she thought about Sharon, a woman she barely remembered but whose story had shaped so much of her life. "I hope you can rest now," Rachel whispered. "I hope you finally have peace." The story of Sharon Holst is a story about time. About how it can bury the truth, but also how it can, eventually, bring it to light. It's about a community that lived for decades with an unsolved murder, carrying the weight of unanswered questions and unspoken fears. It's about a family that never stopped asking for justice, even when it seemed like justice would never come. But most of all, it's about Sharon herself. A quiet, private woman who worked hard, kept to herself, and lived a simple life. A woman who didn't deserve what happened to her. A woman who should have had decades more to live, to laugh, to love, to exist in the world. Sharon's life was cut short on a cold February morning in 1978 by a man who couldn't handle rejection, who let his ego and his anger overpower any sense of decency or humanity. Leonard Hayes took Sharon's life in a moment of rage, and then he spent 39 years pretending it never happened. Living his life. Raising his family. Growing old. But the truth has a way of surfacing. It took 39 years, but it happened. And when it did, Leonard Hayes was held accountable for what he'd done. Not immediately. Not swiftly. But eventually. That's the nature of cold cases. Even when they're solved, the passage of time has already taken its toll. The victims are still gone. The families have already spent years, sometimes decades, living with grief and uncertainty. Justice, when it finally comes, doesn't undo any of that. It doesn't give back the lost years. It doesn't heal the wounds. But it matters. It matters because it says that Sharon's life had value. That her death wasn't just an unsolved mystery, a case file gathering dust on a shelf. It matters because it holds Leonard Hayes accountable, ensures that he doesn't get to die in peace, pretending he was just a harmless old man. And it matters because it sends a message to every other cold case out there, to every family still waiting for answers: the truth can still come out. Justice can still be found. No matter how long it takes. Today, if you drive through Lewistown, Montana, you'll find a town that's changed a lot since 1978. The population has shrunk a bit. Some of the old businesses have closed. The winters are still harsh, the summers still short. But the people who lived through Sharon's murder, who carried that unsolved case with them for decades, they remember. There's a small memorial garden on the grounds of the county courthouse now, dedicated to victims of violence. Sharon's name is there, along with a few others from over the years. It's a quiet place, peaceful, with a bench where people can sit and reflect. Rachel visits sometimes when she's in Montana. She sits on that bench and thinks about her Aunt Sharon, about the woman she was and the life she should have had. She thinks about her mother, about how hard Margaret fought and how much it cost her. And she thinks about the long, winding road to justice that finally, after 39 years, reached its end. Sharon's grave is in the Lewistown cemetery, not far from where her parents are buried. The headstone is simple, with her name, her dates of birth and death, and a single line: remembered always. For 39 years, that grave was a place of unanswered questions and unresolved pain. But now, it's a place of peace. Sharon can finally rest, knowing that the person who killed her has been held accountable. It took too long. Far, far too long. But it happened. The resolution of Sharon Holst's case is a reminder that time doesn't erase the truth. That even after decades of silence, of false starts and dead ends, justice can still be found. It's a reminder that the work of investigators like Robert Calloway matters. That persistence, even in the face of overwhelming odds, can pay off. That cold cases aren't hopeless, they're just waiting for the right person to come along and refuse to give up. But it's also a reminder of the cost. Sharon's family waited 39 years for answers. Margaret spent a quarter-century fighting for justice and died without ever seeing it. Rachel grew up in the shadow of an aunt she barely knew, shaped by a tragedy that happened before she could even understand what it meant. Justice came in 2017. But those 39 years of waiting, of grief, of uncertainty, they can never be given back. That's the cruel mathematics of cold cases. Even when they're solved, the damage has already been done. The wounds are old and deep. And no verdict, no sentence, no confession can fully heal them. But still, it matters. It matters because Sharon's life mattered. Because her story deserves to be told. Because her family deserves to know the truth. And because somewhere, there's another family waiting for answers to their own cold case, hoping that someday, somehow, justice will find them too. Thank you for staying with Sharon's story to the very end. For listening to what happened to her, for caring about a case that took 39 years to solve, for understanding that behind every cold case file is a real person who lived, who loved, who deserved so much more than the fate they were given. If Sharon's story moved you, if it made you think about the families still waiting for justice, then share this video. Tell someone about Sharon. Leave a comment about what stood out to you most. Let us know where you're watching from. These conversations keep cold cases alive. They keep pressure on investigators. They remind the world that unsolved murders deserve attention, that victims deserve to be remembered, that families deserve answers. And if you're part of a community where an old crime has never been solved, don't assume it's too late. Don't assume the truth will never come out. Cases like Sharon's prove that it's possible. That with the right investigator, the right witness, the right moment, decades-old mysteries can still be cracked wide open. If you stayed to the end, you're someone who wants to understand what really happens when the truth is buried for decades. You're someone who doesn't look away just because a story is uncomfortable or because justice takes longer than it should. That kind of dedication to truth is rare. And it's exactly what keeps stories like Sharon's from being forgotten. Some stories change the way you see the world. They remind you that evil can hide in plain sight. That justice is fragile and hard-won. That time doesn't heal all wounds, but it also doesn't erase the truth. This channel exists for those stories. For the cases that demand to be remembered. For the victims who deserve more than a dusty file in a cold case unit. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Rest in peace, Sharon Holst. You deserve so much more than what was taken from you. But your story has been told. Your name has been remembered. And the man who killed you has finally been held accountable. 39 years too late. But still, it happened. And that matters.